I have a problem with fantasy maps. Not that they're all bad. I think this here is a work of art. But if we're not careful, maps can become instruments that pull us towards ideas we don't actually care that much about. And at the center of that lies... It happens automatically. A writer is coming up with a new world, and to better organize the places and their ideas, they start drawing a map. Makes sense, right? But here's the first obstacle. We all know there are many different types of maps that can represent a territory from a multitude of perspectives. And yet, writers, DMs, and world builders will rarely ask themselves what they want their maps to be about. It's just a map, right? Just draw a map. Everybody knows what it should look like. Because the map is often one of the first things that a world builder will think of, and because they're not considering that the type of map they're choosing carries its own themes, then this map making very naturally will push the story towards geopolitics. Once there's a map, and especially a map like this with different nations and kingdoms, our minds start imagining trade, conflict, border disputes, and cultural exchange, and we start creating in that direction. There's absolutely nothing wrong with those elements. Look at how Brandon Sanderson or George R.R. Martin explored the nuances of geopolitics in their respective stories, weaving religion, class struggles, and military tactics into the uniqueness of their worlds. They're clearly passionate about it. But must everyone be the same? If you've ever sat down to draw your map, as I have, is geopolitics your big topic, the thing that keeps you awake at night? If that's your thing, knock yourself out. Draw that map like there's no tomorrow. But perhaps, just perhaps, fantasy writers can have interests beyond border disputes, trade routes, and resource collection. Perhaps some stories should be more interested in psychology than sociology or politics. Perhaps for a lot of stories, a map won't contribute at all. If you look at a simple screenshot of Delicious in Dungeon, you might imagine this is one of those RPG-inspired worlds that surely has a map with mountains, forests, and caves, right? But this world building revolves around a dungeon brimming with life. And the thing is, the dungeon itself is a living organism. This explains some of its RPG tropes. Monsters respawning is simply the dungeon regenerating its own ecosystems. But the interesting thing is that the dungeon is constantly evolving. Going back the way you came doesn't guarantee you'll end up in the same room. Perhaps the room doesn't even exist anymore. The only sort of quasi-map we get is something like this. And it's confusing on purpose. In this world, trusting a map would be foolish. And in this other world, if you believed in any map, you'd be mad. What if the story happens inside, spoiler alert, a dream? Welcome to the classic Alice in Wonderland, where the landscape and the cultures portrayed in the story are all cognitive. Isn't that perhaps even more fantastical than resource allocation and political games? I long for more stories like this, stories with such unapologetic freedom that they can up the fantasy to 1,000. This hyper-unreality that allows for out-of-this-world characters. Yes, I agree that realism has its place and its allure, but wouldn't you agree that a scene like this is also incredibly charming in its own way? It's unpredictable, unchartable. But perhaps you're thinking, this is not the type of fantasy I'm looking for. I do enjoy the gods and the swords and the spells. Then have a look at Hades, a game where you play as Zagreus, Hades' own son, and your goal is to fight your way up the different parts of the underworld until you reach the very top, challenging your dad. How very Freudian of you. And though this is a story with many locations, all it needs is the aesthetic difference between those places, rather than a map pointing you from place A to place B. They could have added a map. I think most creators would start planning a story like this with the different parts of the underworld using a map. But they chose not to. In the end, a map was not a useful tool to push the plot and its themes forward. In this game, you always know where you are aesthetically. and that's enough indication. The closest thing they have is this image here, and it isn't trying to portray distances and divisions accurately. Instead, it gives a more sensorial and emotional idea of the places Zagreus must traverse. But isn't this kind of emotional orientation also a form of navigation in itself? Again, I'm not saying maps are bad. I'm only pointing out that a map, like everything else, needs to build on the themes of a story. So let's have a look at some unusual maps that do exactly that. Persona 5 has a few interesting maps, including this metro map here which, and I can't stress this enough, looks nothing like the real Tokyo. But to me the most interesting is this one, the map of mementos. Mementos is an area that represents the collective unconscious, the pool of shared ideas and concepts permeating that society. And thus, it is an ever-shifting maze. Our thoughts and perspectives keep changing, and so does the world that represents them. This is also translated into game mechanics. Every time you go to Mementos, the layout changes. It is a procedurally generated labyrinth. I love the way the map of Mementos embodies this chaotic nature. It gives you an idea of how deep you are and what gates are open, but look at it. It's obvious the map was never meant to guide you. This is a place you go to get lost, and the map is not lying to you about it. In Inscription, the map we see is closer to a board game. This isn't an artifact you use to find your bearings. This map is only interested in pointing the way forward. And because this is a game about playing games, there's a twist. It's a map, but it's also, in a way, the very territory it represents. The lines are blurred. Yes, you're sitting at a table playing a card game with this strange figure across from you, but you're also walking through the woods, treading forward from campfire to campfire. So the map becomes more than itself. The map and the world are one and the same. What a great concept for a game that's trying to be meta. I wonder who else came up with an idea like that. In The Starless Sea by Erin Morgenstern, and without any spoilers, there's a moment when a character falls into a mythological sea that is at the same time made of honey and made of story. It's complicated, just trust me here. When this character is rescued by a mysterious honey-traversing boat, he's shown a map of the sea. This is a nautical map, not magical in any way, but because of the context of the story, it's a map that needs to be constantly rewritten. She checks the compass again and then leads him down to the captain's cabin. There's a long table in the center covered in beeswax candles. In between the candles there is a pile of paper, all different textures and sizes and shapes. Some of it is transparent, most pieces have lines and annotations. It's hard to map a place that changes, she explains. The map has to change along with it. She picks up one corner of the pile of paper on the table and attaches it to a hook hung from a rope on the ceiling. She does the same with the other corners and turns a pulley on the wall, and the map pieces lift up, attached to each other with ribbons and string. It rises in layers, fluffing up like a multi-tiered paper cake. Looking closer, he can see paper cutouts of tall statues, stray buildings and trees. Gold silk snakes in and out of the lower layers, a tiny boat pinned onto one near the center. The silk trails all the way down to the surface of the table, where it pools in waves surrounded by paper castles and towers. I bet that when I said nautical map, you didn't imagine a series of differently textured papers strung together with ribbons and string and silk. The map here is used to portray character. And that's the stuff of good stories. So, in sum, maybe some fantasy stories need this, but not all do. If everybody does the same thing, it becomes less interesting for everyone. Fantasy does not require maps. It can thrive perfectly well without them. Yes, even epic fantasy. And sometimes when a map is present, it is allowed and encouraged to be its own thing. Maps can look wildly different from one another to fit the themes of their stories. If you ever create your own world, be freed of the tyranny of the geopolitical map. Be freed from empires and nation states. Your story doesn't need to include toilets or food or gravity, let alone nation states. What if your world is all about cities built on the shells of great mollusks, the only creatures capable of traversing a raging ocean? What's the point of maps in a fluid world? What if not knowing what's on the horizon is the whole point of your story? Maybe your whole universe is a metaphorical casino, and distances only matter to people who lose their gambles. So the mapping of it is all about money, not borders or light years. Maybe the fantasy in your story is all about walking inside memories, recording them, changing them. And in such a story, why would you need a map? I believe that by increasing the biodiversity of our fantasy, we make all stories we engage with even more interesting. It gives us more tools, a wider range of inspirations. And everybody wins, even stories that look like this. This is a tiny channel, and if you ended up here, hello, welcome to my small corner of the internet. My name is Jorian, and I make videos about magic and fantasy. Here's one of the best ones I ever made, all about the nuances of language in magic. And please consider becoming a patron, like these amazing people here who dare support me. Thank you so much, folks, and I'll see you next time. Bye.